Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTech 10. If you can give me 10 or 20 minutes of your time, I can give you the benefits of over 64 years of practicing and teaching the skills of high performance and race engine building. In this episode 64, we are going to deal with a subject which has been dealt with exhaustively over the last best part of a hundred. There have been many books and SAE papers on this subject, and yet today, if we're considering your typical V8 engine, and to this day manufacturers still don't have a good handle on how these components should be built, and the point is they are vital for performance, right? We could say that your modern high performance engine pivots around the success of these components. What am I talking about? Let me show you. Headers. So just where are things falling short in terms of headers? Well, let's start off with a bombshell here. How about the fact that if you take a look at any current cup car, it's got an exhaust system which is not optimal by any means. Here's another one. All of those guys bragging about the equal length headers they've got and how their header guy made them within half an inch. You know, let's say he made them exactly the same length. You know what that means? Two things. One, you've got equal length headers, and two, at best, only two of them are right. The other six are wrong. Now it could be that only one's right and the other seven is wrong, and I'll explain that to you. It's all got to do with the way V8 headers sound on a two-plane crank. You'll notice that a V8 engine has kind of a throbbing noise. That's because two exhaust impulses on each bank are happening only 90 degrees apart, so they are not delineated. That's a fancy word I learned the other day, but easier to understand is they're not separated. It's not one pulse and another pulse, it's one and then another one, right? And so they sound like one pulse. And the thing is that our ears, if we are confronted with a noise that's 30% higher than the surrounding noise, and that's the other engine pulses, then we tend not to hear the ones that are 30% less. Our ears tend to just record in a more extensive fashion that larger pulse, right? So it overrides the rest. Now, what else can we do here to make the point, right? Exhaust pipe lengths, right? Anyone that's tested exhausts will tell you that the primary length on a set of V8 headers isn't very important. You can vary it from 28 to 36 inches on your typical V8, and it makes very little difference. So from that, they've come to the conclusion that the primary length isn't important, right? And the other thing is that most people overlook the length of the secondary, thinking it's not very important. It is important. It is far more influential on a conventional set of headers than the primary lengths. Why aren't the primary lengths very critical? It's quite simple. Let's say you've got one primary length right and all the others need a different length, and they do. Right, so what happens is if you take an equal length set of headers, and they're all 28 and only one's right, then you make another set of them all 32, what happens is the one that was right is now less than right, but some of the others could be more than less incorrect. That's what I should be looking for. So what we have is a situation as one exhaust gets worse, another one gets better. And over that length range of like 28 to 36 inches, they all go through a phase where one will be better and another one will be worse. So you end up with a graph of lengths versus horsepower that comes up, levels out, and then goes down. And we operate in that range thinking, yeah, we got it good. It's not too critical here, not like a 4-cylinder engine. 2 inches difference can be the difference of winning a race or not. So the thing is that is not a good thing. It should have been a warning notice to those testing that all is not well if it's not sensitive to length. Now, my first V8 was a flathead Ford, and that was way back in the late 60s. And I was not in a position to make headers for it. So the exhaust system I used was just a 3-into-1. Typical race setup of that era. With what I know now, I should have done different. Right? I've got a good idea of how an exhaust should be done on a V8, flathead V8. But that's not the subject of our story today. Right, so let's talk about another factor here. Header diameter. There's all these fancy formulas out there for header diameter, and they all assume one thing, that the header diameter is a function of engine geometry. It isn't. It's a function of cylinder head flow capability. Now, if you check up in any of my books, I'll tell you how to size the headers in the book. You take a line off the graph from what the head flows, and you come up the graph one way and along the other way, and you plot and say, there it is, that's the size we want. None of this trying it out on a dyno. I've done all that for you. Right, now I have had people say it's got nothing to do with flow, or it's got very little to do with flow. Oh, it's got everything to do with flow. Let us say that you inadvertently had the world's worst exhaust port on your small block Chevy, and it only flowed 50 CFM. Well, an exhaust pipe that's a 1/2 inch diameter will flow 50 CFM. But those people who say no, it's due to the geometry of the engine, will put a 1 5/8 on. Well, it's never going to use the the potential of an 1 5/8 header. So disregard everything you've heard about the pipe size being a function of the geometry of the rest of the engine, the size of the exhaust valve, etc., etc. It's not. It's irrelevant. The exhaust doesn't know what size the exhaust valve is. It only knows the flow. It can understand flow, not size. It doesn't have a little tape measure. It goes in and measures it. Oh, I've got to deal with it. No. So, and I'll put that graph up and we'll talk about it. Before going anywhere, check out the parts of the exhaust that have critical dimensions. This illustration here should show all those that you need to know of. Let's take a look at what fabrication challenges we may have to face. At the end of the day, the primary diameter is the hardest to change. It's much easier to change primary lengths, as in many cases you can just add some just before the collector or hack some off just before the collector. But primary diameters require complete new exhaust system. This is the reason I advocate getting it right first time. Here's the primary exhaust pipe sizing graph that I spoke of just a moment ago. Now, there's a lot of detractors out there that say this is not the way to do it. However, they don't present an alternative, and they are overlooking the fact that this chart works exceptionally well. You will get the right header 99% of the time. You'll see that there are different colors. The race one's blue, a street strip one is the middle line, and the green one is the one for street applications. Now each size suits a particular RPM band. The street one favors low speed, where you'll be most of the time, and the race one favors high speed, where you'll be most of the time. Anyway, that takes care of primary sizing. Before moving on to V8s, let's look at four-cylinder engines just a while longer and look at the different patterns of exhaust that we should use at whatever RPM we're going to go to. For very high RPM, it's a 4:1 every time. But for lower RPM, right, and that's below 8,000, a 4:2:1 is far superior, and I'm not talking about a few foot-pounds here. On a 2-litre Pinto engine, down in the 2,000 to 3,000 RPM range, it was 30 foot-pounds up. So heed what I say here, right? All those of you manufacturers out there making 4:1 systems for imports, think about what they should do for cars which are gutless at low RPM, and you should change over to a 4:2:1 system. We won't go into minis and MGBs here, or any other Siamese port engines. I have some books out on this, and that covers both those types of engines. So let's jump straight to a V8. Why are they different? Here is the answer. Here's a graph of the exhaust pulses at the collector. Note, that's 5 there. We go 1, 3, 5, 7 and back to 1. Here we see 1, 3, 5 and 7. Now take a look at 5 and 7. You'll see they're conjoined. What this means is that collector is seeing 3 pulses. 2 small ones and 1 large one. It's also a little confused at the RPM that it's running at, because whilst it's going between 1 and 3, it looks like 1 RPM, and then when it goes from 3 to 5 and 7, the conjoined cylinders, it looks like a different RPM. And that presents the problem. The question here is, can we fix it? And the answer is yes. And we do that by having unequal lengths, period. Identifying what you suspect as the problem and fixing it can be 2 different things. The question I had to ask myself here, how many headers do I need to get made up to find out which pipes need to be longer and shorter? Well, as it happens, there's a fix at that. And this is where Clint at TFX comes in. Now, TFX manufactures pressure measuring devices that go in the intake, the cylinder, and the exhaust, and they measure the instantaneous intake pressures, the pressures in the cylinders, and the pressures in the exhaust. Now, it might sound like I'm off the subject here, but when flow benches became common practice, the average engine builder started creating far more horsepower than they did before. Now, the advent of the flow bench as a common item was probably due to so many people seeing me use a flow bench before they had one in my articles and things, and they probably thought, man, this guy's a writer. Pfft. Research engineer's proper title. And he's got a flow bench, and maybe we should get one. Right, and they did, and Superflow sold lots of flow benches due to the fact that I had one of their flow benches, as well as a monster one I made myself. And that was all done to British standards. Very accurate, and it was about 15 feet long by about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. It would measure airflow to less than 1%, and boy, it was such a long-winded deal. But I got a superflow and then checked to see how much they related to each other, and I calibrated that superflow and found it to be very close to what I was seeing on my, I say super bench, my monster bench, right? But now we're at a point now where the flow bench is everyone's, and their mother's got one. Hey, I've got 4, right? Another story there. But the next move in this deal here has got to be in-cylinder pressure measuring. And TFX makes that possible because their prices are so much lower than anybody else's. It's unreal. Now, I did my first electronic in-cylinder measuring deal back in 1977 at Superflow. Now, their deal was very expensive back in 77. If it had come out in 1977 that is, it would have cost probably around about $40,000 at a guess. TFX ones are currently under 15,000, so they're cheaper than a high-end flow bench. Well, they're cheaper than a mid-range flow bench. And we use that, and the beauty of it is, if you know how to use one of those types of devices, then you can identify which cylinders need the pipe shorter and which need longer, right? Well, I'm conversed with all the necessary, how shall I say, gas dynamics to do that. And what it allowed me to do is identify the change in length of each cylinder virtually by looking at the graph and saying, it needs to be 4 inches longer for this RPM. Oh, it needs to be 6 inches shorter, right? And that's what we did. Now, basically, the setup that you see in the following photo, I looked at one side of the engine and the other side. The side on the right with that great big curving header is the one that required to be longer on that side, and the one that required to be shorter doesn't show up because it's shorter. On the other side is the standard exhaust that we started with. So let's take a look at that and then take a look at the power curves that we achieve with this, and you will see that this is the way to go. So if you're an exhaust manufacturer, get yourself one of these TFX pressure transducer deals and fix that damned exhaust, because I don't want to be doing everyone's research for them all the time. On the left is a conventional header. On the right is an unequal length header. Just how much going to all this trouble to make a header like this is worth, just check out these horsepower and torque figures here, and you'll see the difference is pretty substantial throughout the RPM range. Here's our chart in its entirety, top to bottom. Bit difficult to read here, so we're going to check out the top first and then the bottom. The easiest way to see the improvements is to check out the 2 right-hand columns in red. That's gain in torque, gain in horsepower. As you can see, the low speed gains are pretty substantial. As we get towards the mid-range, so the gains are less. But now let's check out where they go from here. As can be clearly seen here, once we start to climb into the higher RPM range, so the gains get bigger and bigger. At 6,000 RPM, we're up almost 30 horsepower. However, what you should be taking note of is the average gains here. That's the figures in red across the bottom of the chart. With the conventional headers, average torque over the entire RPM range was 668 foot-pounds. That went up to almost 688 foot-pounds, a gain of 20 foot-pounds average. Horsepower, that went from 574 to 590 foot-pounds. So, bearing in mind the small changes here, you can see the gains are very worthwhile. Now, what were the changes necessary to acquire these increases in power? Well, I'll give you those figures toward the end of the video, and with a few provisos that you need to take note of. Right at the beginning of the video, I alluded to the fact that cup car headers were, how shall I say, little off being optimum. And you have to ask the question, do the cup guys know what they're doing? Well, mostly they're pretty smart guys. Now, there are a few that aren't so smart, funny enough, these are the ones of my biggest detractors. Got one that's got speed in his forum that I'm on. And I thought, boy, that's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. But anyway, not the point. I don't need somebody that sarcastic in my life, but if he wants to play the game, hey, I'm ready for a challenge. That's who I am. That's how come I used to look at professional race car drivers when I was a kid and watch how they go around corners and things and say, I can do better than that. And that's when I was 10, 11, 12, in my early teens. And guess what? I could do better than that, as exemplified by the fact I've set track records on every major track in the UK. So, proves the point. Now, let's get back down to this cup car header, right? That's a 4 into 2, a long secondary 2, and then into 1. They do work better than a 4 into 1 manifold, but they're not optimum. Now, I seem to remember there's certain rules that kind of restrict the type of exhaust these guys can use. So, do they know better? Well, I've bumped into a couple of cup car guys who have told me straight, they know that there's a better exhaust than that. It's just that constraints on them, they can't use it. Now, I don't know what they are. Somebody out there may be able to explain it. So, don't look at a cup car header and think that it's the ultimate. It's not. But that doesn't mean that it can't be made better by those cup car guys if the circumstances were surrounding the issue were to allow it. Here's my cup car engine with a 4 into 1 header setup. In this guy's, which was kind of a cup car spec, it made 743 horsepower and 529 foot-pounds of torque. And that's 9 foot-pounds and 20 horsepower up on the cup car team that originally built it. So how good are the cup car headers? Oh, they're good, but not as good as they could be. Now let's look at the dimensions necessary for a unequal length header. Well, here we go. Before going on though, please remember this was our first time around. This does not mean that this is the ultimate in unequal length headers. Far from it. This was done straight off the data that our TFX pressure measuring device gave us. And it was tuned for peak torque at 44 to 4600 RPM and peak horsepower 5800 to 6000 RPM. The nominal length of the header, that is the one that was what we started off with, was 36 inches. So the other cylinders 1, 4, and 6 were +4, cylinders 2, 3, and 5 were -4. Collector length is as shown there. Again, a word of warning here. These are not necessarily the optimum lengths. It would be just too much for us to consider hitting the nail on the head with such a short time of development. I've put the word out there. Now it's up to the header manufacturers to pay attention. Let me make a guess here, and I could be completely wrong, but I think Holley will be the first one to take up this unequal length header, and that's with their hooker range of headers. And as I see it, for a very small increase in price, there's no downside. Well, that's about it for this section on exhaust. Have we covered everything that I wanted to talk about? Hell no. Right? We've only just broached on the surface. The next video I do on exhaust, I'm going to look at collector lengths in particular, collector designs, and exhaust systems with anti-reversionary properties, and ask the question, do they work, when can we use them, and how best to make them. So what this means is you need to subscribe, get notified, like, share as much as you can, and lastly, on my grief relief deal, you need to hit that thanks button for the donations to St. Jude's. Thank you for watching.